Hello, my name is Larkin Rose, and if you're not already at least a little bit familiar with me and what I do, this project may not make a whole lot of sense to you. If you are a little bit familiar with my work, you will know that mostly what I do, by way of articles and YouTube videos and books, including my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, is I point out that the entire premise of government and authority is inherently bogus. It's inherently irrational and inherently immoral, and that not only should society be without government, but government is intrinsically an insane idea and horribly destructive. And I've debated lots and lots of people about this, and I used to be a statist myself. I used to believe in government. I used to advocate that until over the years I eventually came to realize that my own belief system was inherently contradictory, didn't actually make any sense. But we are all taught political mythology, and most of us repeat it. And the trouble is, if no one ever hears those ideas challenged, they never think of anything else. And if you go into the mainstream media or academia, you will hear a debate that starts with the assumption that there is such thing as a legitimate ruling class, government, and that constitutions and elections and rituals make that okay, make that valid, make it legitimate. And then they bicker about the details of, well, how should it rule and how much taxation we should have and how much regulation and legislation we should have and all that. The entire debate skips the underlying premise, the underlying concepts and principles, which are inherently bogus. And it's very easy to prove that they're inherently bogus. However, like I said, if nobody ever hears those ideas, nobody ever thinks about them. And so in the mainstream media, the talking heads, you won't ever hear those things questioned. You will hear everybody, political left, political right, everything in between, assuming that there's such thing as legitimate government, and assuming things which go against the concept of self-ownership, that the individual owns himself, against the concept of the non-aggression principle that says you shouldn't initiate force against somebody else. People believe that, well, if you do it by way of government and law, it's perfectly valid and legitimate, and in fact necessary for society that we all grovel to a ruling class to force our opinions on everybody else. But because the debate doesn't happen in the mainstream, people don't hear about it, people don't take it seriously, because they assume that if there was anything to this, you would hear it in the mainstream media and in academia, where you hardly ever do. The purpose of my project that I'm just now launching on Kickstarter, called Government on Trial, is to make that debate happen, and to show that even those who are most respected, most educated, most intelligent, and well-meaning, and have all the fancy credentials, no one can rationally justify the existence of government, of a ruling class. Nobody can explain how it would have acquired authority, and in fact, it's very easy to demonstrate that it can't possibly have acquired authority. So what I want to do with this project is, for starters, target 100 of the most respected, credentialed professors, mostly at the college level, of philosophy and civics and government and sociology and a bunch of related fields of thought, to send them a letter. I'm going to send them a copy of my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, and whether they read that or not is kind of optional. But I want to send them a letter that has a series of questions. And soon I'll have the actual letter up so people can see what the questions actually are. Again, those familiar with my work can probably guess what some of them are. For example, I'll do the short version. Can you delegate to someone else a right that you don't have? Very simple question. Obvious answer is no, you can't. Another way to ask it is, if there's something that would be immoral for you to do, can you make it moral for someone else to do the exact same thing? The obvious answer that everyone, you don't need impressive credentials to say, no, duh, if I don't have the right to do it, I can't give you the right to do it. Very simple, very basic stuff. Follow-up question, can two people who don't have a right delegate that right to somebody else? And then you go on to, is there any number of people who can delegate to someone else a right they don't have? And at this point, most people instinctively understand, you don't need a PhD to say, no, you can't give someone else a right you don't have. You can't alter morality. If it's bad for all of us to do it, we can't make it good for somebody else to do the same thing. Very obvious, very simple. However, it completely rules out the possibility of legitimate government. Because if I don't have the right to tax you for whatever I think is okay, and my neighbor doesn't, how did anybody give to Congress the right to tax you? As just one example. And then there are other lines of questioning which also make authoritarianism and the political mythology we're all taught makes it fall apart. Such as, is there any ritual a human being can do that makes something bad into something good? And if not, that means that legislation is always either redundant because it just happens to match right and wrong, or it's illegitimate because it's pretending to make something evil into something good. And writing down on pieces of paper that, well, we're allowed to do this evil stuff, still evil, it doesn't make it good. And of course, every regime in history that did evil stuff legalized it first. Well, did that make it good? No, it didn't. Now, I'm doing the very short version of these questions here, and when I'm writing the letters to professors of philosophy, I'll be very precise and very careful in the wording, and ask that they write their responses to. It'll be less than a dozen questions. It may be less than 10. I don't want it to be long-winded. So I will send out these packages to, for starters, 100 different professors of philosophy or government, civics, ethics, that sort of range of ideas that all tie in with the belief in government, and ask them for a written response about these things. Now, I'm going to publicize the fact that I'm sending these questions. I will list the 100 professors, teachers, whatever, that I send these questions to, and so that everyone can see that they were sent the questions, and then whatever response they send back, if any, I will publicize and post unedited and in their entirety on a website that's just for that. And then for those who send back substantive responses, I'm going to invite them to do a live discussion or debate, depending on how you look at it, on Skype, which I will record and then post videos of those discussions and that back and forth, post that on my YouTube channel and on the website. And the purpose of this is so that the general public, if the general public hears somebody ranting on a YouTube video, it's so easy to think, well, maybe you have a few points, but what do you know? You're not an expert, you don't have credentials, and presumably the people who know better, the experts, the PhDs, the professors of philosophy and professors of government and everything else, they understand this. Of course they know best, and of course they would have an answer to this. Well, I can very easily demonstrate that they do not. I don't care how many credentials you have. I don't care how many years you've been teaching about government. The belief in government is provably insane, and I can demonstrate that simply by asking questions of anyone who advocates government of any kind. I don't care if it's left, right, totalitarian, limited, constitutional republic, anything in between. The entire premise of government, no one in the world can answer these questions consistently without contradicting themselves. But this is a debate that has to happen, and it hardly ever happens because the mainstream media and academia doesn't like to talk about this. They like to cling to the underlying paradigm that, of course, government is legitimate and necessary and we need it, and without it we'd all be violent cavemen. And then they argue and bicker about the particulars and the details, which don't even matter. But you won't hear almost anywhere in the mainstream or almost anywhere in academia, with very rare exceptions, you won't hear these ideas discussed. As simple and basic and obvious as they are, I want to make that discussion happen because I think it'll be invaluable to the rest of the world to see that not only are the assumptions we've all been taught, the paradigms we've all been taught about government and the political mythology we've all been fed about democracy and constitutions and republics and consent of the governed and representative government and all that, not only does it not make any sense, but there's nobody in the world who can make it make sense, even if they've been teaching it in college classrooms for 50 years. This project is going to demonstrate that there is no one no one in the world who can give a consistent, rational, moral justification for believing in government at all. And I know that sounds radical, especially to people who aren't familiar with my stuff. There are now thousands and thousands of voluntarists who are familiar with this, who now look back on what they believed before and said, wow, why did I ever believe that? That makes no sense. Who have already gone through this process. But it's time to get the rest of the world to go through the process. The reason my book is called The Most Dangerous Superstition is because the belief in authority, which includes the belief in government, is horrendously destructive. It is the primary threat to humanity. And the fact that all the decent, average, normal people still believe in an obligation to pay tribute to a ruling class by way of taxes and obey a ruling class and call it being a law-abiding citizen, they still use that as the measure of whether you're a good person. That has to change, because the amount of suffering and injustice and outright murder that comes from the belief in authority is just unimaginably huge. And it's time for it to change, and that can only come about through a debate. And I'm going to make that debate happen where it should be happening, not just in random one-sided YouTube videos, but in challenging the people who, if anyone in the world should be able to justify and explain a legitimate, valid government, it's these people. So these are the people I want to target with this project, to invite them to explain their position, their beliefs, and see if they can explain to the world how government can even be in any way coherent or rational. I want the whole world to see that there is no way to make government into a sane concept.